Good afternoon and welcome to the New South Institute book. I just want to say that we are very grateful for everyone who managed to join us today. My name is Jelena Vidojević and I will be facilitating today's conversation. It's the book called the Socialist Yugoslavia and an Online Movement, Political, Social, Cultural and Economic Imaginaries. The book explores the non-aligned movement through the lens of the Socialist Yugoslavia, and it also tries to unpack all those multiple and diverse relationships between the Socialist Yugoslavia and non-aligned movement. I think that this is a very important book, having in mind that the non-aligned movement, as Paul says in his introduction, was unfortunately actively forgotten in the post-Yugoslav space for the last 30 years, only to be remembered recently. So it feels relatively recently. So it fills the gap in existing scholarship. What is also nice about the book, it's not only the historical account on those relationships, it also tries to trace and identifies the legacies of the movement in the post-Yugoslav space. Another important why this conversation is relevant today is that after the end of the Cold War and after the non-aligned movement somehow lost its voice, it left a void for the countries of the global South that haven't been properly filled since then. And recently, especially after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the whole concept of non-alignment has been often used. Unfortunately, what the usage of that concept reveals is that very often there is a misunderstanding what non-alignment represented. There is a confusion between non-alignment and passive neutrality, or at best, even if there is an understanding of the concept and understanding of its value, what is lacking is the way forward. So I think that the conversations like this can contribute significantly to bring some more clarity into this area. The book is edited by Paul Stubbs, who is today with us here. Paul Stubbs is a sociologist and a senior research fellow in the Institute of Economics in Zagreb. He is also a member of the New South Institute Reading Club. So I will ask Paul to give us a short presentation, and after his presentation, I will ask other speakers, Professor Radmila Nakarada, Professor of Peace Studies from University of Belgrade and a distinguished NSI Fellow, and Ivor Chipkin, Director of NSI, as well as Feroz Khan from Stellenbosch University, to give their comments and thoughts on the book, but also on the topic. So Paul, let's start with you. In a very opening paragraph of your chapter, you say that non-aligned movement was just one of the number of the world-making projects after the Second World War. So what distinguished non-aligned movement from these other initiatives, and what made it exceptional?
Oh, I didn't know you were going to ask me a question. And I mean, I think what makes it exceptional was that it managed to carry on and do some things for so long. But thank you, Jelena, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is the first virtual book launch. We had a launch in Zagreb, we had a launch in London, and we had a launch in Belgrade. This is the first of already two that are planned. One is planned for May the 24th, and I can see Rade Verkovic here, who read every word of the book in draft and was a great support to us. And together with Piro Redzepi, we're going to try and tease out more about decoloniality through the frame of the book and through a kind of almost a critique of the book as well. But I do want to shout out to the authors because I'm just the editor. I can see Augustin Koszowski is here and Yuri Ramczak. I also see Natasha Mishkovic, who was kind enough to write the I won't out you, Natasha, but you were kind enough to write the endorsement of the book, so thank you for that. Other contributors in the order that they appear in the book: Chiara Bonfiglioli, Peter Willits, Gal Kiern, Tvrtko Jakovina, Bojana Videkanic, Bojana Piškor, and Georgia Valmazovic, Liliana Kolesnik, Mila Turalic, Dubravka Sekulic, Nemanja Radonjic, Leonora Dugonic-Rodwin, Ivica Mladenovic, David Hennig, and Maple Raza. Some of them may join. Somebody will try and look. The book really came from a conference that we were supposed to have in Belgrade in March 2020, funded by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. We'd bought people's plane tickets, but for obvious reasons, it was cancelled. And those people who were due to come to that workshop stayed in touch with each other and decided to have a book project. And we basically had a virtual workshop for 4 days in February 2021, where all of the authors of what became the book kind of spoke, and it was an open workshop, and we exchanged ideas with people. We ended up submitting the manuscript in 2021 in May, getting comments and resubmitting in December 2021. And although it says on the cover, it says inside, it was published in 2023, we actually got it in our hands at the end of 2022. So I actually think for an edited book, it was quite quick, really. And I want to thank Candida Hadley, who's here, who was a brilliant kind of proofreader, and that was important. And, you know, McGill Queens were very supportive as a publisher. Though I have to say the book's expensive, but, you know, there are probably ways of getting hold of it without paying all that money. But that's nothing to do with me. So let me just start with, like, I do think there are 18 of us writing the book, but you could find 3 times as many people now. Why has there been, and Jelena touched on it, why has there been this reinvigoration of the field of study of non-alignment and of socialist Yugoslavia? Well, part of it is, of course, the study of global socialisms, the relationship between socialism in the East and socialism in the South. But part of that is also about global Yugoslavia, trying to look at Yugoslavia and socialist Yugoslavia in a global context. There is this work, you know, that lovely, lovely book by Adam Gatarchov, this work on alternative world making, counter-hegemonic world making, and of course, together with, I think, the G77, this fits as part of that, but together also with, you know, the African Congress, a whole load of world-making projects. There's also a lot of interest on this between the post-socialism and post-coloniality. And as Jelena hinted, there's now a new literature on why the non-alignment movement and why the new international economic order, which is what I'm working on now, are actually relevant for the current conjuncture. Yeah. There's work on non-alignment from below, about memory, everyday life, and decoloniality from below, I think. There's work on cultural, artistic, and architectural exchange. You know, a lot of the people who've contributed to the reinvigoration of this are not in formal academia, they're museologists or they're cultural activists. And there's a lot of work on student exchange, including kind of oral histories of people who studied in Yugoslavia and so on. So that's important, I think. If you haven't read the book yet, the book is trying not to be nostalgic. The book is a critical appreciation of the non-aligned movement and of socialist Yugoslavia, but it doesn't treat it uncritically. The critical appreciation is aware of the contradictions and the tensions. The book itself deliberately promotes diverse, multidisciplinary perspectives, right? It promotes different styles and genre. Bojana Piškor and Georgia Balmazovic have a graphic novel form, because the graphic novel was used in socialist Yugoslavia to popularize political themes. Mila Turalic, who is, I mean, I think she's also an academic, but she's a filmmaker. but what her essay is about in the book is pictorial images, still images from documentary films that she found in the archive in Belgrade. All right. So we have different styles and genres, different themes, and quite deliberately different conclusions. There was no way that I was trying to impose a party line. Arguments and disagreements within the book are fruitful and useful. I'm not going to use the word productive because that's a neoliberal word, but they are fruitful and helpful, I think, right? Now, I was asked to say a bit more about the non-aligned movement for those who perhaps don't know much about it. And I just want to say 5 or 6 things. Why did it happen? And it happened because of the moment of decolonial sovereignty, right? In 1945, there were 51 member states of the United Nations. By 1960, there were 99, all right? And so this rising of sovereignty seems to me to be incredibly important. And Mila's just joining, so she didn't hear me praise her, which is good. But of course, there were processes of counter-hegemonic world making before the non-aligned movement, which formally started in Belgrade in 1961. The Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian States in 1955, the connection between, and Bob Vitalis is here, who's written about this, the connection between Bandung and non-alignment is a complicated one. But in a sense, I kind of think if there had been a follow-up to Bandung, there probably wouldn't have been the non-aligned movement, you know? But India and China had a border dispute. It became very difficult for that Bandung process to continue. And so those of you who know about the myth of Yugoslavia, the meeting on the island of Brioni between Nasser, Nero, and Tito in 1956 was really, really important, but sometimes can be overstated. More important was the 15th anniversary UN General Assembly in 1960, where Tito, Nasser, and Nehru were joined by Sukarno of Indonesia and Nkrumah of Ghana, really quite horrified by what they saw from the United States and the Soviet Union at that meeting, and basically started to put in motion the idea that there would be an event in Belgrade in 1961 that wasn't going to be one of a series. It wasn't called the non-aligned, but it actually turned out to be the first of many meetings. 25 countries came to Belgrade in 61. In Cairo in 64, there were already 47 countries and 10 observers, including national liberation movements. But for the rest of the 60s, it kind of became a bit moribund. It was working in the 60s on, you know, global insecurity, questions of disarmament. In a sense, there was a real fear that the world was going to be blown up. Everyone was going to be blown up by the superpowers out of control. There was, this is important for the South African audience, there was strong commitment to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and Zimbabwe, but I'm not convinced that it generalized from this to a kind of global politics against racial capitalism at that moment. It also helped with the formation of UNCTAD and therefore with the formation of the G77. And in the 1970s, as Tito was joined by new interlocutors such as Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, and also Indira Gandhi, it turned much more to questions of economics and questions of neocolonialism. And Lusaka and Algiers, Lusaka in 1970 and Algiers in 1973 are really important in laying the foundations for the new international economic order. Why Yugoslavia? Well, Yugoslavia was a socialist state, but it broke with Stalin and the Soviet bloc in 1948. It needed new allies. It needed new markets. But it also, because of its history of anti-fascist struggle in the Second World War, had a genuine affinity with decolonial movements, with liberation struggles, and it offered real, tangible support. Any of you who are in Belgrade should go and see the exhibition in the Museum of African Art that Mila Turalic helped to curate, and she has a documentary film on Yugoslav connections with the Algerian liberation struggle. It was real, it was tangible, right? There was genuine decolonial affinity. But the Yugoslavs kind of had a contradiction. They were not part of the global South. They were kind of steering the movement in the early days, but kind of didn't really want to do that. They paid for many of the early kind of events. So I've come up with this term liminal hegemony, which of course can't exist. But that kind of, contradiction is important. They were also quite skeptical of what they would call pseudo-radical ideas, but ideas like the Conference of New Emerging Forces by Sukarno, which Yugoslavia would have been excluded from, and of course the Tricontinental in Havana, which Yugoslavia was excluded from. So they were trying to develop a practical radicalism, all right? Key concept was self-determination between the two blocks. It wasn't necessarily anti-capitalist. Indeed, there was an attempt to kind of de-ideologize. The Cubans wanted to be much more radical in anti-colonialism. Cubans wanted to criticize the Americans more than they criticized the Soviets. The Yugoslavs wanted to be more de-ideologized, okay? And I've almost finished my introduction, but I just want to say something about why it seems to now have come back in, partly in relation to the kind of the invasion of Ukraine. And I suppose there are 5 elements to this, maybe 6 for me, at least. One is, of course, we need peaceful coexistence and the right to self-determination more than we've ever needed it. All right. And those were fundamental concepts. Secondly, the idea of general and complete disarmament, not only because actually being killed is not a great idea, destroying the world is not a great idea, but actually if you have a general and complete disarmament, you can spend more money on good things like health and social welfare and education. All right. The third thing, of course, although, this is easier to say than to do, Amilcar Cabral in Cairo in '64 said, the United Nations is a giant with its hands tied behind its back. If only we could think of an agenda in which the UN was reformed, responsive, and representative. And a lot of the demands of the non-aligned movement was for that. Fourthly, and of course, this is where the new international economic order becomes important, a framework for global socio-economic justice. There's a huge debate about how radical was the original new international economic order, and we can discuss that. But clearly, there was a framework for global socio-economic justice there that we need to return to. And I think there are 2 more at the end for those of us who are activists or researchers. One is, okay, for those of us living in Europe, living in Croatia, I don't want grants to compare Croatia with Italy, Austria, and Germany. I don't want money only to be Eurocentric. I think the idea of actually revisiting those circuits of decolonial affinity between the East and the South is really, really quite important. And that challenge to Eurocentric knowledge is really important, so there's another bit of what I want to do in the future, which is also about how did knowledge from the global South impact in Yugoslavia as well. It was a joy to work with the contributors to the book. We want the book to be a conversation. I'm delighted that this first Zoom is with the book club from the New South Institute, because we are breaking news, trying to work together on a book on concepts from non-alignment, in which we also kind of talk to other people. Like I've talked to Joanna Bockman, Vijay Prashad, Firoz has talked to. So, we don't want to see this as an indulgent thing about the book. We want to see this as a conversation about the relevance of the book for the future. My phone did not go off. Does that mean I didn't take more than 12 minutes? Or perhaps it does. Perhaps I stopped it accidentally. But thank you for listening, and I look forward to a really good conversation.
Thank you, Paul. Before I ask Radmila and Ivor and Feroz to share their comments and maybe questions if they have, I I prepared 2 questions, and you actually partially answered one of those, or opened one of those in your introduction. So when you were answering the question, why Yugoslavia? You said that the partisan anti-fascist struggle was something that created, at least at a very symbolical level, some resemblance to the anti-colonial struggle. So what I think is missing in the book, so you don't use that argument in your chapter, but I also don't remember seeing it in other chapters, is that countries from the Balkans, countries that emerge, that were part of Yugoslavia then, had also had their own colonial experience. And only a few decades before that, they did liberate themselves from the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was maybe a slightly different form of colonialism, but it was still a colonialism. So I think that that is one of the notes that I wanted to make. The second point is there is a very subtle contradiction. Maybe it's not a, maybe you don't see it like that, but that is how I saw it. When you talk about like a very particular position of Yugoslavia, you says that Yugoslavia itself was a project of modernity otherwise, and that it wasn't trying to catch up with the West. It was very progressive. And then it's certain at the very end of the chapter, when you are describing circumstances in a late socialist Yugoslavia, you said that the inequalities and the relationships between the republics started mirroring the North-South divide and started resembling, or can be qualified as, a neo-colonialism or internal colonialism. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that. So, but you don't have.
But I'll keep hold of those. Yeah, I've written them down. I'll remember them. So I won't answer. But
thank you. I will ask Radmila now to share her thoughts.
Thank you, and greetings to all. I'm very happy to take part in this discussion. I want to congratulate the editor and the authors for a very inspiring book on many levels, reminding us of old questions and their relevancy, and I think bringing out some new insights and together with them new questions. I also attempted in my own thinking to answer the question that Paul has posed, what the book represents as a collection of works that is not only a historical journey, but I think a beginning, or at least a participation in an ongoing conversations in very different places. So I think that it also reflects the feeling of uneasiness and suffering and depression concerning the polycrisis we are living, the global enemy, and the challenges we're facing that are articulated over and over again, but in a moment or in a period that doesn't seem to produce rational responses, that doesn't seem to produce transformative projects that are mobilizing in the same way that non-aligned movement was. So I think it's a reflection that speaks of the ongoing search to transcend the dangers, the apocalyptical potential that we're living. And as Paul quoted, to seek globalization otherwise. So in that sense, of course, I think we all identify with the motive, if I read it correctly. At the same time, I see the book as an instrument of critique, both of the non-alignment experience, but of the really existing world as well, because inevitably you're pushed into making analogies. The anecdotes covering the actors make you nostalgic about the competences and professionalism that was recognized and part of the whole experience, widely missing. The heroes of non-alignment, if you make a list, and a number of authors have mentioned lists of these heroes from the continents that were included in the movement, again, speak of an empty space today. Where are heroes of a similar stature? You can hardly name 2 people or 3 people that can be compared to these heroes. So this is just an illustration, but I think the analysis that is presented in various forms and in various segments makes us intensively aware of the different voids that exist and the regression, at least in the political elites, in the formulation of projects, in the diagnosing of the present, and in the creative responses. And I loved one author, I don't remember now which one, I'm sorry, cited the phrase, weapons of mass creation. And this, I think, is an excellent phrase that we are actually facing that challenge of creating weapons of mass creation. The book exemplifies some paths towards that, but it also, I think, speaks of the void. So it's an inspiration. I don't see it as a sort of a memory lane type of a journey, a historical journey, but with its historical references, it sheds additional light on the experience, and but from another perspective. And this was mentioned by Paul, the relationship between the partisan practice and the non-alignment movement, the analysis of deeper roots that transcend the Cold War as the framework where non-alignment appeared, the various sectors like art and education getting new limelight in the context of analysis, I think are very important. There are also little details that I will just mention one of disappointments that I found in a way also nostalgically inspiring. For instance, the detail that when Allende's party asked for financial assistance from the Yugoslav politician who was visiting them there, and this was refused. I think the sum was like $50,000. Allende, it was the first election that he was participating, which he lost. But considering that later the relationship between Allende and Tito's respect for Allende evolved, this seemed like a sad misreading of a moment, and it sort of caught my attention. But on the other hand, the contribution that, for instance, depicts the voyages of peace really impressed me. I mean, we've been listening to this Galeb story, the seagull boat, the famous boat. It's turned into a myth. It's been an object of irony, whatever, luxurious, hedonistic style of Tito. But when I looked at the months that were spent in these journeys, I haven't made a precise mathematics, but it almost amounts to a year. So can you imagine any one leader today taking that much time and devoting his energies, his whole entourage, his focus on talking, searching for allies, listening, and then ably conveying that into a mobilizing message and a project that gathered so many countries. So in a sense, I had a different attitude and much more respect for for that initiative. And I think it also speaks of the energy that was involved by these who were active and in creating this movement. But on the whole, if I draw a line, the book evokes, I think, mixed feelings. On the one side, some melancholic, depressive feelings, because Yugoslavia is in the title. Yugoslavia does not exist. So we see the faith of Yugoslavia as part of this story. Then it's again a very intriguing and complex message that came out. On the other hand, one of the axes of controversy between Yugoslavia and Cuba would imply if Yugoslavia went down this road, that Cuba went up her own road, but that didn't happen either. So we have two representatives of both style and ideology that were important for the movement, both ending, I think, in a very dramatic and tragic way. On the other hand, we are, I think, with justice, legitimately, I think, possibly depressed by the fact that the agenda of the non-aligned movement, taking all the principles in the critical manner that they have been presented in the book, but in big blocks, are still the essential agenda after more than 60 years on the global scene. And the confrontation of the big powers that was supposed to be eased by this movement, by the end of the Cold War, has come back in such a dramatic way that we are again talking and worrying whether we'll all blow up and whether the planet will survive this confrontation. So peace, as Paul has said, peaceful coexistence, development, independence, common good, global good, all these concepts are still concepts that we have not found the right answers. And the new geography of integration, even though we talk about globalization, I think is part of our agenda. The renewed respect that I came out with after reading this book, in spite of all the limitations that have been pointed to and the historical marginalization of the movement, I think is in its capacity to have so many directions, that it's multi-directional in terms of political, economic, and cultural endeavors. And I think that is a legacy that needs to be respected, that it demonstrated the spirit, and I'm not trying to be funny, it really was a spontaneous formulation that came to my mind of realistic idealism in spite of the controversies. There was both realities interconnected in ways that sometimes they did not reach what they were supposed to, but often they did, having both realism and idealism. And I think it was a credible effort to transcend binary divisions and historical linearity, to demonstrate really powerfully the importance of respecting the diversity and transcending racial and ideological divides. And I think the fact that subjugation was the central concept that united all the actors is worth remembering, because I think that is also something that we are facing. So I'll just mention 4 questions I had. Coming out from reading the chapters, it seemed like there were 2 trends. One represented by a formulation that the non-alignment is actually a conservative side of anti-colonial struggle, that provided support for sovereignty, but ended up incorporating the sovereign countries into global capitalism. So my question is this a conservative movement or an emancipatory movement, a counter-hegemonic movement? Because this is what I saw as sort of two ways of the way the NAM was approached in the book. The second question was in the analysis of the Latin American situation and the powering constraints of the United States that limited the cooperation. The present power constraints and power that is not only located in the visible realms that we see, but in many other realms of reality. How much do they allow for alternatives to global capitalism to appear today? And if we have economic, military power, digital power that is asymmetrical, is a global integration in terms of what non-alignment presented at all possible within this neoliberal paradigm? And concerning the contradiction that Paul had depicted in his work on Yugoslavia, I would like to ask whether South, the concept of South and South-South cooperation, is something that does not really pertain only to a geographical space, but to common social predicament and common social conditions. I would be tempted to say that the class concept here on a global platform is something that unites, but we don't even have to go there. I just think we share a predicament that transcends the geographical identity. And I would ask whether anyone thinks this makes sense. And just two little comments that I wish to show some disagreement with what was said. One was a comment by an author who said if we were to reapply the main principles of both Bandung and non-alignment movement to the present crisis in Ukraine, we would support the Ukrainian struggle against Russia. I think that is reducing the potential of these principles. I think they would have been activated much earlier in an attempt to prevent the war between Russia and Ukraine. That they would have acted as mediators, analyzing and understanding where the conflict is heading and what the dangers of this conflict were. So I think it's a mistaken interpretation of the potential that the movement had. And the other one concerns the last chapter in the book, where it discusses the among else, the relationship towards the migrant crisis in 2015. Again, I think it's reduced the framework, the photo of the situation, because it seems to present like the refugees coming from Islamic countries were welcomed by the Muslims in coming from Serbia or ex-Yugoslavia. But I think at least in the first round, the welcoming was much larger and broader, and it transcended this religious approach, and I think reflected non-alignment more consistently. And we ourselves here were surprised by the way they were greeted, the refugees, and taken care of. And it looked like, for once, Serbia could do something that is a surprise in a very positive way. So I would suggest that when we make these photographs, mental photographs, that we try to catch all the actors who were involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Radmila. I will now ask Ivor just to quickly share his thoughts and maybe ask a few questions, and then we will leave it to Paul to summarize or to choose which of these questions you want to address. So we have at least 10 or 15 minutes for the people who joined if they want to ask a question or to make a comment.
I'm not going to say much other than to say, Paul, there are many things which I loved about the book. And some of the more conceptual historical issues I'd love to take up with you, but outside this particular forum. The one which I was fascinated by, and you said it again in your presentation, was this work which I'm interested in, and some of my work takes me to, is this notion of self-determination. I was perhaps not surprised, but nonetheless fascinated to see how the term is used in the book relatively uncritically. As something necessarily or unambiguously, perhaps not positive, but at least not requiring too much critical engagement. So I was surprised by that, and Adam Getachu's book on world making I find unconvincing in a whole range of key areas. One of them is this key relationship to the concept of self-determination, which I think is a concept which emerges in particular in the 19th century, early 20th century, in relationship to giving national expression to the former colonies, if you like, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that self-determination, I think historically is unambiguously is a national self, where the nation there is conceived as ethnically, religiously, linguistically homogenous. So what I've been interested in the work that I've been doing is the movement of that concept of self-determination, which I actually think is quite problematic, into the mainstream of anti-colonial struggle, and in particular the way it gets taken up by African liberation movements, which are becoming a centerpiece of their own politics, and therefore installing at the center of their own politics a concept which seems to fit so inadequately within the African situation. So that's broadly the broader sort of conceptual lines which I would be fascinated to explore with you further. But here, just for the moment, just to say, in South Africa today, which will be well known to those of you who are on the African continent or in South Africa listening, but perhaps not so well known outside South Africa, South Africa is employing the language of non-alignment almost every day. The country, the South African government, has unambiguously not allied with the critique of Russia. It has sustained very close relationship with Russia. There's even it's even in an awkward situation with regarding to the International Criminal Court, because it looks like South Africa will soon host Putin in Pretoria, and there are all sorts of awkwardness. So, and South Africa uses this, the way in which it explains this is in the language of non-alignment. I would be interested to understand, just in terms of the broad breadth of the book and in terms of your own understanding, do you think that the way in which the South African government is using the term non-alignment today resonates with the way in which it was used historically? And it relates to Radmila's ending question around how one, if one was applying the perspective or the framework of the non-alignment movement, how one would think about the Russia-Ukraine war today.
Okay, thank you, Ivor. So Paul, maybe you want
Firoz, who's the other member of our reading group, has his hand up.
Okay. Because
Paul, I want to just follow up on what I was asking. Thank you, Paul. What I was asking, I mean, how does national self-determination now find its expression in things like resource nationalism, or on the other hand, the fight for national sovereignty, which means actually control over resources? I mean, so I just wanted to know about that kind of level. The second question I have is that, look, I mean, there's different kind of cooperation regimes in the world. I mean, the one is, the United Nations, the other one is the BRICS, and then the other one is the kind of new structural transformation of China, and Belt Road Initiative. And I wanted to know, these were not kind of cooperation regimes that existed during the times of non-alignment. So I just wanted to know your kind of views on that. And then the third issue is that I want to ask is that, there's been, third issue, I want to disagree with Radmila, is that there might not be, in fact, the IMF is not talking now about geo kind of economic integration. It's not talking about actually policy reversals, and they're arguing that the world is entering a period of geo-economic fragmentation. They're actually calling it GFC, and they say there's policy reversals and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to hear your views on that, just offering all kind of different openings and different spaces for that. Thanks.
And these are such good questions that I'm so tempted to take the easy way out by saying that actually I really only know about 1945 to 1979. So that anything before, which was Yelena's beautiful question about, you know, colonialism and Ivor's beautiful bringing in of an earlier etymology of self-determination, are outside my sphere. And I almost don't want to go beyond 79, because when Tito dies, the fragmentation of Yugoslavia also gets played out through different notions of non-alignment, different relationships to the non-aligned movement, structural adjustment, the World Bank, and so on, and then of course nationalism. But I'm not going to do that. I just want to say thank you so much for like the close reading and the brilliant engagement with the book. And I will take a few things, and then certainly Augustine has to come in. What time's your Greek lesson?
In 10 minutes, actually.
Okay, so I'll take 5. Because he can answer Latin American questions, and Radmila, I shared when I first read his draft that sense, because it was because of Allende I became politically active, you know, that sense of a failure to really engage with that struggle in Chile was shocking in a way. But I want to start with Ivor and self-determination, and I think it is probably the contradiction that I didn't mention, but it is running right through the book, which is the contradiction between nation state sovereignty and notions that the nation is a very weird vehicle for political action that is both too small and too big, right? Because it constructs homogeneity, nationalism, but it also can get in the way of transnational identities and feelings. So how to think through scale is really important here. And I think we've discussed in the reading group Vijay Prasad's work and that notion of the need for a double movement. One is sovereignty, the other is popular uprisings against what remained of a kind of feudal or a bourgeoisie and stuff. So that is part of this here, I think, which needs to be taken into account. So let me go back one by one. Yelena, I think the anti-fascist struggle was much more than symbolic. You know, you can see that actually Senghor and Tito could talk about both being imprisoned, you know, and so there was real stuff here. But I think part of what I'm struggling with is not having a knowledge of that earlier period, but also I'm struggling with not wanting to conflate colonialism, imperialism, and racism. Of course, they're all very linked to each other, but they're separate. So I actually think one can talk about the Yugoslav space as having different relationships to imperialism, but not necessarily colonialism. But that's another debate, you know, and I think it is important. And I do think that, yes, where I'm going with some future work is about this complicated resonance between the outside and the inside and neocolonialism. When I was in Pristina, kindly Artan invited me, I can see him here now. That was part of the discussion, you know, how one could think through that, and how conceiving of non-alignment from different spaces within the Yugoslav socialist space would be really important, you know, and how we kind of think through that. There was almost nothing I disagreed with from Radmila at all, because the criticisms were to other people, actually. But that actually, yes, I do think like realistic idealism and emancipatory conservatism are actually part of it. And Moisov's book actually says we were the radicals, because some of these radical ideas would have just meant the end of the movement. So this sense that Yugoslav diplomacy had of what was possible at a particular moment was probably a really, really important way forward. And of course, we've had this conversation when the new international economic order movement becomes important. You know, Algeria, Mexico are much more in the forefront of this than Yugoslavia, but Yugoslavia never really tries to undermine it. Although you could argue from an economic perspective, the semi-periphery was different from the periphery and so on and so forth. So I think it is important. I would argue that we can see non-alignment, the relevance of non-alignment and the tricontinental together. So not a non-alignment and Bandung, but non-alignment and tricontinental would be a decolonial, a deterritorial notion of anti-coloniality, right? It's no accident the Black Panthers were present in Havana, right? And it's no accident that what you're talking about here about South-South cooperation is about class and is about oppression, right? The oppressed of the earth and famine and this kind of stuff. Yeah, I actually, you know, the invasion of the Ukraine happened after the book had gone, the first draft had gone, and one author asked to add something, and I wish like either nobody had added it or everyone, because I think we would get very different views of how we understand the Ukraine crisis. And I've written something which you were kind enough to comment on, which is just as frustrated with liberal fundamentalists who kind of won't have NATO expansion as part of the story, as I find a deterministic left, which pretends to condemn Russia in the first couple of sentences, but is really only about NATO and the United States and proxy wars. You know, I do think you're absolutely right that powerful diplomacy and moral force of non-alignment would not be that quick to judge things. And I think that's important. And the last chapter of the book I actually really like, but I think, you know, there is this issue of that solidarity was also beyond Islamic solidarity, but was also about Islamic solidarity. And actually, some of the things I'm working on now is that the late 70s, there was real concern that, you know, the second oil crisis, it was Islamic solidarity that took over from a more global South-South solidarity, which undermined the coherence of the G77. So there's lots of stuff there. Final point, yes, BRICS, yes, Belt and Road. But your point, and of course, we hate great men theories of history, right? We hate nostalgic notions of heroes. But, you know, where are the templates? You know, BRICS is interesting in terms of its idea of common currency. It's interesting in terms of its view of a multipolar world, but it doesn't have that emancipatory idealism that you can find in the non-aligned movement. The only place I could look for it would be in some Latin American movements, you know, so Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, Chile kind of stuff, which deliberately gives me, Augustine, the chance to say something before you go off for your Greek lesson.
Yeah, hi. Okay, so I wasn't planning actually on intervening, but I really enjoyed all of what Radmila was saying, and I think that she got many of the most important points of the book, like, and most of the most important ideas that the book tries to convey. I really appreciated most of those comments. I have to admit that I have very little time and even fewer answers to what she was trying to address. As for, if I understood correctly, one of the questions that Radmila was asking was concerned the possibilities of something related to or similar to non-alignment in Latin America today, right? Or the possibilities of actually developing some sort of emancipatory politics or global politics from Latin America and the world today, considering the many limitations that come from Washington's and in general from different countries' power in the region. The first thing that I would say is that I'm a historian, so I think that I'm not sure that I'm actually authorized to give an opinion on this. I think that I can say something about that as someone who follows politics, who comes from Latin America, and who thinks that some of these ideas resonate in the world today. And if I can respond to this question more as an observer than as a historian, or as someone who knows this history, but who doesn't think that necessarily this history informs any of our current reflections on this. I think that absolutely none of these emancipatory projects are possible today. And I think that if any of those, I mean, as probably you probably got it from my chapter in this book, and if you read any other of my works on non-alignment, you'll find the same thing. I am quite critical of the non-aligned movement's deficiencies and shortcomings in general. And I believe that it was a project that in many ways, as I said in this chapter, was basically a series of gambits. And I believe that in general, even Tito was not, I mean, in this point, Paul and I do not really have the same ideas. I think that Tito was playing an endless series of gambits, which did not necessarily lead anywhere. And I think that Milorad Lazic's last book, recent book on non-alignment, also shows to what extent all of this construction was basically a house of cards. I think that even today, it is much less possible to do so for many reasons. The first one being that we don't live in a world which is as the one from the times of the Cold War. I think that contrary to what happened in times of the Cold War, when there was an ideological struggle, there is no ideological struggle whatsoever today, or basically, I mean, it's not comparable to the one that we lived through in times of the Cold War. I think that all decolonial or anti-colonial discourses today are no longer tied to any idea of popular emancipation or of alternatives to capitalism. So I think that in that sense, there is actually no place where non-alignment or anything resembling non-alignment could enter. The structure of discourse is so different in the world today. And I think there's even something different related to the way in which information circulates. The non-alignment had basically, the only thing that non-alignment had was moral power, if you ask me. It's the only thing that non-alignment had. They did not have enough economic power, nor political power, nothing except for moral power. And they had huge moral power at a certain time because of how the global moral sphere was constructed. And we have nothing like that today. And that is why I believe that what we do have today is conflict. Yes, I'm taking this comment now. There is controversy, there is conflict, but it is very much on a pragmatic level and very much on the level of geopolitical interest. I do not see that level of ideological density that actually gave birth and gave meaning to non-alignment. And even less in Latin America. I think the only country that could nowadays and is actually currently pushing for some form of non-alignment is the only country that has the economic and demographic grounds to do so, which is Brazil. And it's the only country that can do something like that. And even in that case, it cannot do it with the same high moral standing that much of non-alignment had. So again, this is my opinion as something who's, I'm someone who's just, watching and following what's happening. I'm not sure that I can say much more. And please do not take my words as something that comes from any sort of historical research or inquiry, because it's just my reflection, and that's what comes now on the top of my head. So I have to leave now because I'm becoming now a scholar of Cyprus. So I'm learning Greek, and I'm really sorry, but I have to leave you now.
And before you do, not only do Augustin and I disagree with each other, but we continue to work together. And yes. I think that's the whole point of the book, really, and the thing. Yeah.
Before you go,
thank you so much.
I just want to thank you for joining our discussion.
No, thank you so much. I think it's a wonderful event, and I'm really happy that everyone, that so many people are interested in what we are doing and what we've done and what we will continue doing. It also shows that it's a promising subject. It also shows that many people will actually join us in these endeavors. So great. thank you so much for organizing it and for giving me some time to share these very light thoughts that I just gave you. Bye.
Thank you. So before I ask if there are any more comments or questions or just thoughts from the audience, I just want to add something to what he said. I think when he said that there was a moral standing of these countries and the world was somehow different, I think my impression is that there was also a little bit more faith in multilateralism, and there was a little bit more faith in the UN and what can be done with the existing global infrastructure. Now that is gone. I think that the UN lost a lot of its integrity. There is no more faith in multilateralism. So that also makes these things much more complicated.
Can I jump in here?
Yes.
I mean, and maybe this is to introduce a note of South Africa centrism, but for a while, I think, and I'm still quite committed to the idea. I think for a long time, and the idea of South Africa was very much maybe not a new non-aligned movement, but certainly an emancipatory project, not just for South Africans, but for the world. And dealing, as Paul Gilroy has put it in one of his books, putting race firmly on the agenda at the emancipatory level and dealing with it successfully within the framework of a democracy, which is why I think all of us should be enormously concerned with what is happening in South Africa, the democratic setbacks, but also just the collapse, if you like, of large portions of the South African state. So I don't think that this is just a South African story, and I do think it does fit into this much larger global politics.
Okay,
Thanks. I'm not going to name them, but I can see a couple of the other authors of the book, and I think it would be great because we don't have often this chance if they want to say something before we do general things. But hopefully there are things in the chat and people can respond. And we have at least another half an hour, don't we, Elena?
No, we actually planned for an hour and 15 minutes. But
okay.
If some of the authors want to comment or to pose a question, we can stay longer. Maybe not. Or someone else from the audience. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, there is a.
Yeah, Zoltan, I can see.
I think he needs. Yes, you need to unmute yourself.
You're muted, Zoltan. I don't know whether it's you who has to.
Sorry. I was just, tapping and it didn't work. Sorry, I just jumped in, and since nobody wanted to contribute right now, I thought I'd just say something. So sorry if it will be something rubbish or too much improvised stuff, but we were discussing these topics with Paul and some others previously, so I'm also very enthusiastic about the book project. I'm very happy about this discussion, and I was really glad that the discussion brought up the historical comparisons with contemporary politics, and that sort of pushes the whole agenda of the idea of what non-alignment means into a historical long-term perspective, and that might help us ask questions about how these agendas were politicized and what were the actual interests behind. And from my perspective as a geographer working in decolonialism and the global history of colonialism, I follow a world systemic perspective. So maybe some of these ways of politicizations and ways of integration might be answered from the perspective of the world systemic integration into this capitalist world system. So that's my approach. And what I really liked was the idea, and I'd like to push this a bit more because I'm interested in what you think, is that non-alignment was actually a very conservative trajectory, or started as such or ended up as such. I'm interested particularly in the very early development from the 1950s on Bandung Conference in 1955. Some of my research is connected to that, and I found that often non-alignment, the non-aligned movement is romanticized by leftists and decolonial thinkers as anti-systemic, which is for various reasons true. And of course, we could point out how race and colonialism became highly politicized as an anti-Western revolt against Western hegemony, etc. But still, there was a very conservative trajectory. And I'd like to point out the role of Eastern Europeans, not just Yugoslavia, but for example, in my case, Hungary, that the fact that what I found interesting, there was a race for anti-colonialism between the socialist camp and the anti-communist refugees. And these people who fled to the USA really influenced the Bandung Conference too. My own example is Prime Minister Ferenc Nagy, who was the refugee prime minister in Hungary, who really influenced the agenda of Bandung to open up the issue of colonialism so that it could encompass and include Soviet colonialism too, as a critique. And that really built on the fact, of course, it was supported by the US, but and funded by the CIA, but really pushed the agenda that many of these Muslim religious countries and many of these early integrations, which were suspicious of Soviet activity, could have formed an alliance with these very fresh refugees, Eastern Europeans. And there's a longer term history of these anti-communist integrations, which were part of non-alignment. So this is what I would push. And last remark to this is that I'm very much interested in the Indian intervention and influence in Eastern Europe in the 1950s. So for example, the 1956 revolution in Hungary really offered an opportunity to connect to non-alignment as a revolt against the Soviet influence. So there were particular political agendas at that time. They were just very short and unsuccessful. So just to wrap up, this is what I'm interested in, but also I would point out that perhaps this non-alignment was also a political strategy for flexibility of these new countries, many of them very new countries, of opening to both camps under more systemic pressures of dependency. So as you could see, African socialism or non-alignment, for example, or Pan-Africanism, these ideas in Ghana or in other West African countries were actually used as ways to open up economically through foreign policy to Eastern European socialist camps. So the smaller countries in Eastern Europe, it offered flexibility. It wasn't really that sharply defined or in a way that would conflict with many ideas of socialist internationalism. Yeah, just to put it short. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your comments. It's really fascinating. It's a completely different and a new approach. And now when you mentioned that the Indian influence in, especially in Hungary in '56, one of the thoughts that I had while I was reading a book, although book represents a very nice and very extensive collection, what is actually missing from the book is the Indian link, to say it like that, because there is no chapter covering the links of Yugoslavia in India, apart from the chapter that explores the difference between the non-aligned movement and a Bandung, and then trying to maybe more elaborate the Indian position on both. So Paul, this is more of a question for you.
No, I think that's really good. No, and thanks, Zoltan. So I'll start with Zoltan and then the India thing, because I think what's really important, I just spent a month in London, and yeah, I shouldn't name it, but scholars of Eastern Europe and scholars of Yugoslavia, historians, really don't speak to one another very much. And yet, the moment any of us do any work on what was really going on, we see exactly what Zoltan's talking about, the complexities of different countries with different amounts of autonomy entering into what I've elsewhere called a kind of conflict cooperation kind of dance. You know, sometimes Yugoslav architects were working with East German architects. Ghana was working with the Soviet Union and with Yugoslavia. So this becomes really important. And Zoltan, you'll be delighted to hear that the work I'm doing now on the new international economic order, of course, it's the critique by Wallerstein and Samir Amin that is devastating in terms of what this new international economic order actually was about, with the incorporation of bourgeoisies in the periphery into global capitalism. And so I think this is a really important point. Jelena, I could do at least 40 things of what is missing from the book, but I think the chapter on the relations with India is really, really important. And this gets really quite complicated because of the dynamics of Indian politics. But of course, Nehru was very reluctant to be part of this. He didn't really see this as somewhere where India could develop its kind of global framework. Indira Gandhi was much more positive about it. And in the 70s, you end up with some initiatives that she's very supportive of, including an initiative which I'm trying to work on as well, which is the non-aligned news agency pool and the New World Information Communications Order. And it reminds me of the question of Radmila about digital power, which I didn't answer, but I think, you know, they did understand neo-colonial relations in media were just as important, or a subset of the neo-colonial economic relations. So my final point would be that, yes, very conservative trajectory, but deeply contradictory in its emancipatory conservatism in a way. And you cannot come down on, this is where I argue with Augustine, you cannot come down on one side or the other in terms of the conservatism versus radicalism debate. You have to be very careful. What is it you're talking about, when, and who are the actors here? Because it really does change over time. And one of the complicated things for me about some of this literature is longue durée studies versus conjunctural studies, but that's to open up another conceptual can of worms, actually, which I'm not going to do.
Okay, if there is no more questions and comments, I would like to thank Paul and everyone who participated, and the speakers and the audience, for joining us for this, what was for me fascinating conversation. And I hope that we will continue having the conversation on similar topics. I would use also this opportunity to announce the new book project of this reading club that will hopefully come out in few months. And it is called The Theory of from the non-aligned movement, where we are trying to identify and follow the afterlives of the key concepts that inform the activities of non-aligned movement, like self-determination and sovereignty, like peaceful coexistence, like decolonization, like peripherality and dependency. So we are definitely continuing this conversation. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Good to see you, Ted. How are you doing? What happens if I don't leave? Can we chat with those people who are still around?
You can stay.
Oh, super. But no, everyone will leave probably, but it's like...
We have 13 persons.
Yeah. Yeah, and now I realize that apart from Zoltan, everyone else has actually gone off to make a cup of tea, but they've left the Zoom on. It's like kind of really.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was amazing.
Thanks, and Zoltan, see you, mate. Good to good to actually have you join and not ask for a recording and a streaming. All right. Take care. Ciao.